one of the books that have impressed me most in this area is Sarah Shayer's Thieves of State. And her argument, most of what she writes is about Afghanistan. And her argument is like this, that one thing that has been seriously underestimated in this area is the problem of corruption. So she says that what actually drives many people into the arms of insurgents in many countries is not really that they like them, like the Taliban or so. It's that the West is supporting governments who are basically thieves, who steal from them, or thoroughly corrupt. So I wonder if the causality doesn't go in the other direction here. So it's not sort of fragile states that creates the problem. It's basically corruption that creates civil strife. And both the large N analysis and when we have done quite detailed analysis of outbreaks of civil war tend to show that one reason that people take to arms is actually corruption. Because in a corrupt state, if you are on the losing side, you will not only lose, to have to pay more taxes, and so you lose your job because you belong to the wrong side. You will lose protection from the rule of law. Basically, the winning side will come after you with everything they have. And this is what makes people take to arms. The two first persons that are killed in the Yugoslavian war are two Serbian policemen who are fired because they are Serbs in the new Croatian state, and they are protecting, they want to keep their jobs as in the post office.
Thank you. We'll take a couple more questions at the back and then here, and then we'll get some answers and move back.
Hello, my name is Julia Park, and I'm a student in education at the University of Oxford here. My question is about who gets to build governments in fragile states. So basically, is it politically ethical for intervention to occur? And is it possible for aid or other forms of intervention to be apolitical? And if not, what measures can be taken to protect the autonomy of states?
Thank you. That question here.
Thank you. I'm Heather Marquette. I'm at the University of Birmingham. Actually, my question follows directly on from that. A former student of mine who worked in the UK Stabilization Unit did some research on the UK's state-building, peace-building framework in Zimbabwe as a case study. And the Zimbabwean academics that she interviewed pushed back on her about the research questions and said, how can DFID or the international community more generally do state building without doing nation building? And actually, nation building is the foundation of building governments in fragile states. But the question they asked, and that I would ask of the panel, is what is the legitimate role of the international community in nation building as opposed to state building? And one very quick question for Stefan. How do you know a government is really legitimacy seeking? How do you identify that? Thank you.
Thank you. So 3 questions. One on corruption. How big of a factor is corruption in fragile states? One on who gets to build governments in fragile states, and one on state building versus nation building and legitimacy seeking. We go in the same order and pick whichever question you want to answer.
Yeah, so let me give half answers to a few. That's maybe the better way, rather than giving full answer to one. I mean, on Bo, I mean, it's, one day, Bo, I'm going to accuse you of confirmation bias, actually, proving that it's all corruption, everything. But in this particular context, I would kind of argue, corruption is also a symptom here of predatory behaviors. Now, is predatory behavior the same as corruption, seeking behaviors, or whatever it is? But I would follow you in saying, and in some of the countries that I kind of look at, or at least superficially look at, let me be honest, and what I was mentioning is it is either, finding alternatives to these predatory behaviors or finding ways that actually a realization, or maybe it's related, that actually you get a higher return from not being predatory but actually being cooperative, maybe coming from it. And corruption is then a symptom of these things. I think it's there, but we can talk more about it. So things like legitimacy of outsiders. I hope, I work for one of these outsiders that tries to do all the time some of these things. I hope that those who were listening to me were saying I'm extremely cautious about what the outsider can do. At best, we can respond to things that are happening in context. I mean, my underlying opinion is anything you do with aid is politics. There is no neutral aid. There is no life that you save in a kind of a neutral way. It's always politics. So there is an element that, the kind of naive neutrality even of humanitarian players, I just don't believe in it. So as a result, is there a legitimacy for us well, I think the most of the legitimacy is to us to respond to things that are happening. If you're saying, if you're saying that, to bring stability and a settlement in the country, the UK or DFID has a role to play, then I'm willing to listen. I'm not saying that necessarily your voice is the only one to listen to, but I'm doing it. So, but there is something. Nation building versus state building. I'm a Belgian. Nation building? Well, what nation? And I give that answer actually. I think anyone who comes back to saying it must be nation building, well, I'm not sure. I come back from Tanzania. That's not nation. That's a strange idea of nation building. It is a state building, I would say, that they did, because it's all the different things. I have troubles with identities of nationhood and so on. So I'm not sure, and I'm sure I give a terrible answer. When do I know someone is really legitimately seeking? Of course I don't know, and I can only try to see exposed whether behaviors and actions and outcomes seem to be consistent with development. I personally interpret what Ethiopia does is legitimacy seeking. Some of the people I know that are in government are saying, no, we just think it's right. Now, I still am quite glad that there, at least to some extent, and we could have long arguments on it, but to some extent, development is seen as something that is worthwhile pursuing by a large group of the technocrats that run the government. So then I'm satisfied they try to achieve development, but I do think that it is consistent what they're seeing. I can't design a Popperian falsification test to know whether they are not legitimately seeking or not, but it feels quite consistent with a reasonable theory. But we can talk about it more later on, because I have a sense it's a bad answer what I gave.
Thank you.
Yeah. It's a bit difficult sometimes when, especially in a panel like this, when we talk about fragile state and you talk about conflict states. Corruption is very important, but then again, the barrier or the bar of corruption, somebody's maximum does not meet somebody's minimum. So again, we have to be realistic about corruption. I mean, you cannot go into a country again and try to apply the method of Sweden or Denmark. You have to encourage people to move forward into being part of that state. But if you start tackling them with the anti-corruption rules that you have them here, the standard that you have in the West, again, in the end, corruption is corruption. But how do you prepare people? I mean, states that have been living in corruption, how do you encourage them to move forward in tackling corruption? I would rather see corruption decrease 10% this year. I should have a plan of about 10 years. I don't want to go into a country and say, listen, this is the rule, the manual book that is being used somewhere in the West. I want you to apply it. Otherwise, you're not a real estate. This is one of the things. And then again, to go back to the outside intervention, when I talk about outside intervention, we would like, I mean, the recipient country have to be prepared to receive that intervention in a way that will reflect itself positively. But just to say, today when you see what is happening, all these crises that are happening, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya, I think there is a moral duty that we have to seriously think by intervening and helping and ending these crises. When you see this mass exodus that you see in Syria, or when you see these killings all over the place, I think there should be some, whether it's under the umbrella of the United Nations or whether the under umbrella of regional groups that will have, mostly some of the Security Council have to be involved in it. So we have to seriously think about this. And I think state building or nation building, today what you would like to see in many, it varies from countries to others. Some countries would like to see peace right now. Get that peace moving and then think about building that state. How do you build that state? You don't want to build it the way it was built before, where it was built on isolation, where it was built on tribes or in... so learn from these lessons, and I hope that these wars will give us the lessons that we can move forward into a much better future. I hope so.
Thank you. And we're quickly running out of time, so if you want to address some of the questions, and then we'll take one more round, hopefully, before we close the session.
In terms of who should build the states in fragile context, it should be the locals. It's very difficult, it's very lengthy process, very complex, but a chance should be given because the political process takes time. And in case of Afghanistan, the main debate at the beginning and late 2001 in December was how to frame the post-Taliban political order. So one was like the footprint, heavy or light footprint, but they went for the light one and let the locals to lead the state building process. But there was a bargaining process, and also they utilized local tradition, this Loya Jirga, the Grand Assembly, which a traditional Grand Assembly to legitimize the post-2001 political order. To some extent, that agreement was one of the most successful one in terms of implementation of the benchmarks identified. The second issue, in terms of corruption, I'm a little bit skeptical with the argument of Sarah. She is putting, because when we are talking about corruption, we should identify what types of corruption we are talking about. So the politics of patronage is one issue, and corruption, bribery. So generalization is a little bit risky. The context that Sarah is talking, especially in case of Afghanistan, as in some parts of Afghanistan, the tribal politics, there is rivalry going on. And this argument of that bad governance or corruption leads to insurgency, especially coming to the context like Afghanistan, is a little bit, we don't have much evidence to support, because the insurgency which is going on in Afghanistan is, we would call it rentedist insurgency. Lots of other factors are contributing to that. And we had like lots of demonstrations in Kabul against corruption. So people choose to fight corruption in different ways. But if we look at the insurgency of Taliban, they have an ideology, they're committed, and also in terms of their source of funding is totally different.
Yeah, on the question of corruption, I also have some reservations about whether correlation is also causality. I mean, I'm sure you can track fragility along those lines, but I'm yet to be convinced, particularly because I think some of the issues related to so-called patronage and so on are also issues around state formation. I think the problems with some of the arguments around corruption in this case would be, it's almost like there would have been a time when patronage didn't exist and when things were less corrupt. But in fragile contexts, we also have to bear in mind, I mean, particularly the ones that the context that I most deal with, the state formation as such, is already quite nascent, and that in of itself creates certain types of politics. So I think that needs to be borne in mind. the role of internationals in state building and so on, and whether this kind of political work should be kind of off limits. I would agree that, you know, all aid is political by its very nature, and I think what we're talking about here is a kind of a recognition that it is political, and what you then go on and do with that. You know, I know time's limited, so I won't say much more on that. I was at the those initial talks. I think it was around 2008, 2007, when DFID was in its very big reflection about what to do on the state building front. And there were, I mean, a lot of discussions were held at the OECD, within INCAF and DFID itself, and there was talk then of the nation building question. I remember asking a question very much like yours. And I think there was kind of a sensitivity and a fear of it sat very uncomfortably with the role of an international organization to engage in building a nation as such. I mean, I think there was already enough kind of sensitivity even around the state building agenda as a kind of colonial project, really. And if nation building was added to that, I think it would have made it more difficult. I think I'll stop there because of time.
Great. We'll take a couple more questions. We got two at the back and then one there. If you can make them brief so we can at least have a chance to have a 1-minute closing statements answering those questions.
Hi, I'm Richard Stanforth from Oxfam. I'm a Middle East policy advisor. This question of how we engage and aid with fragile states and the economy is becoming a fundamental question for Oxfam at the moment, in the sense that banks, the financial sectors around the world, are not wanting to deal with fragile states anymore. So for Oxfam, and this has not really been a big issue for us at the moment, but it's an issue for all the private sector in Yemen and an issue for many development charities now in Syria, Somalia, across the world. We can't send funds. Accounts are being closed down, so it may be impossible to address, you know, Mohammed's problem or issue around economy. But I'd perhaps like to hear from the panel. Maybe are you thinking about this? Are there any solutions that you can see? Because the regulatory framework is so hard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha De Silva, World Bank. I've just finished 4 years in Afghanistan. I've also worked in Yemen, Ethiopia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. I think one of the most important dimensions of nation building, whether we're talking about legitimacy or nation building, is civil service, the civil service of the country. And this is something we just don't focus on enough. It is also probably one of the most important elements of nation building. I think Dr. Bizhan talked about the National Solidarity Program. It's delivered entirely by NGOs, but the minute there is a conflict, the NGOs leave, and you're left with government, but that's where we've also put the least amount of resources. The World Bank puts most of his money through government systems, but not many of the other donors do or want to do. And this is partly as a result of thinking there is no capacity in government. But the more you don't invest in government, the less chance there is of government really taking ownership and building. So my question to the panel is how do we focus on that, and how do we make that the center of any development policy lending that we do?
Thank you. And I think we are running out of time. We should be soon moving to the next one. But if anyone wants to address those two questions before we conclude, go ahead, Kathryn.
Yeah, thank you. On both those questions, the first from Oxfam, the dialogue is, as I said, when I went through what the peacebuilding and state building goals are, one of them was building economic foundations. And we have been, for the last few years, trying to develop, in the light of my colleagues' comments, a focus on development, economic development in fragile contexts. And I'll just say one little thing about a project we're doing now, which is in collaboration with an investment fund with BNP Paribas to try and get investors to think differently about fragile contexts. And it's quite interesting. I mean, it's quite innovative. We're trying. It's like a communications pitch almost. And what will be interesting is the door it will open in terms of having a conversation about the issues that you're just raising. All fragile contexts aren't the same. Somalia is not Sierra Leone. I mean, that's the kind of thing. So anyway, we'll see where that goes. But we take it very seriously. On the second point, on the civil service point, excellent point. It reminds me, most of the work I had done before joining the dialogue was on Nigeria. Nigeria, just like Ethiopia, has got very interesting experience of political engineering, building a nation out of a country which is some 400 odd different ethnic groups, 11 main ones, which is based around something they call the federal character principle. So, I mean, it's very contested. However, it's an attempt by Nigeria to ensure that all civil service appointments are based on a kind of quota system, where the composition of the country is reflected in the composition of civil service, and married to meritocracy principles. So it's not just a quota system where you kind of pick, but you also marry that within groups with a kind of merit. It's been very challenging, but it's been running for some 20, 30 years with varying degrees of success.
Just very quickly, so totally agreement actually on this point on civil service. I think building a civil service in these countries that is not the same as state building, it's not the same as politics, it's not the same as parliamentary accountability and transparency, it's actually about, but it's also not just technocratic little skill formation. It's actually creating the space for a grouping of people that is allowed, that has legitimacy to work independently and so on. And it's not just about little technical skills trainings and so on, but we need to do it, and we clearly have forgotten it in quite a lot of settings. And the point that you make on the private sector incentives, you have the examples there of how the incentives now change. One of the things that I find so striking is that we usually talk about the private sector. Actually, fragile states typically get, unfortunately, the private sector they deserve. They have extremely weak regulatory environments, really thing. The private sector that's active, you usually don't really want them to be active there, actually, to be honest. But you would like to be able to make sure that the incentives are there, that call it, the better private sector, the blue chip firms, so to speak, will want to come there. And the problem with the regulatory framework internationally, it's now actually going backwards rather than forwards in that respect. So in a DFID context, we are spending 50% of our money now in fragile states. My God, that's difficult. We also want to spend far more on economic development. My God, it's difficult in the best of places to do this. But actually, it is something there that we are there. So I'm not going to say we're going to do this perfectly well, but it's with a recognition of the points you make there. We need to just find ways of shifting these incentives back to attract the quote-unquote good private sector into these places that actually wants growth, not bad private sector that just wants to have state links and grab rents and do even worse things and so on and so on. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And we'll have Rotendo from the MPP program wrap up this session by telling us, did it answer your questions? Is there a key takeaway that you have for that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So my name is Rotendo, and I am an MPP student, and I'm from Zimbabwe. I think the two things that I think are most important to take away from this discussion is, first of all, the importance of knowing what good looks like. I think that this is a point that Kathryn raised earlier, where she said we sometimes just don't know what it looks like, and maybe it doesn't look like Sweden, and it doesn't have to. But I think that having goals and having context specific, yes, but having an idea of what exactly a state that is now stable and a state that is being built the right way looks like. And so that's the first takeaway. The second one, I think, is about balancing the kind of parallel institutions that grow when there's a parallel state. I am from Zimbabwe. I've seen kind of a parallel institutions grow out of the fact that our state is so fragile. And so I think it's important to balance out the fact that you do need to have project finance, you do need to go outside of the government for you to get things done, but at the same time, do it in a way that doesn't undermine the trust networks that was spoken about, and doesn't undermine the legitimacy of the institutions, not the people in them, but the institutions that are there, so that when you have a long-term project of building a nation, you need to be able to still trust in those institutions. You need people to still see the things that are happening in their country, solutions that are being grown in their countries as being legitimate and as being useful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And with that, we'll end this session. Please join me in thanking the panelists, and then I'll ask you to move to the other session across the hall there to just get feedback from both sessions and then wrap the day up. So thank you so much for your time.